some of the best measures to build resilience into your supply chain as a business is supply contracts, building in a bigger margin, and maybe insurance programs. Would you add any more to that?
Most procurement teams will be allergic to the idea of expanding the margin for their suppliers because that's just like diametrically opposed to their incentive structure. I would say that you need to make sure that there's a playbook. I'm thinking from the perspective of a sustainability leader, let's say in a brand. If you want your procurement team to work with you on taking risk out of this, you need to do two things. One is explain to them that long-term their KPIs are going to suffer if together you don't solve this problem. And that's because changing suppliers can often be disruptive and have a cost. And having a supplier suffer a shortfall in yield versus expectation and not be able to provide output when expected will have an impact on the brand in terms of its economics.
Hi everyone. Today we're going to talk about the massive underappreciation of risk exposure in agricultural supply chains. We're going to explore how climate change is reshaping supply chains and uncover some of the emerging risks, discuss mitigation strategies, and examine what all these changes will mean for your environmental data. But before we get going, hello, Seth. How are you?
Hey, Izzy. I'm good, thanks. I'm good. I am enjoying the weather volatility in the UK. Which right now is tilted in our favor. But what I find just a bit crazy is how you go out in the morning and it's freezing cold, and then suddenly in the afternoon it's boiling hot. So you're always poorly dressed for whatever you're going out for, which is very different to what I had growing up in Pakistan, where it was consistently hot or consistently cold. Now, it might be a location thing. It might just be a time of this cycle thing.
You know what, when I was scoping out the brief for this podcast, I was like, I really hope Seth brings up the weather in our intro spiel, because I was like, the likelihood is he probably will, because he's got that English tendency, but it's all to play for. But I did want to talk about the weather because I think that is a big underlier for all the risk that's going on. Even now, the weather is delaying crop planting, it's impacting yields. There's like big news around farmland in Russia, China, India, parts of the US, which are experiencing either really hot conditions or a lot of rainfall. And I think we've seen it not just this summer, but around the whole world, around the whole year. So even in autumn of last year, there were rumours of beer and cake production in the UK like flooring because of the wet weather, and it means that the breweries and beer prices are going to rise, and everyone was up in arms. But Seth, what's your take on all of these kind of climatic issues and how they're feeding into like crop yields and also like supply and demand of different types of foods?
Yeah, I want to take a parallel from a market that understands risk very well and maybe just talk a bit about how that plays out versus the sustainability space where I think we don't understand it half as well. And frankly, even procurement, where I think we could have a much better understanding. And the market I'd look at, which is quite topical right now, is if you look at financial markets, anyone who's been following anything related to financial markets knows that about a week and a half, 2 weeks ago, you started to see this massive change in stock prices across the world, really, but I think starting or most prominently in the US. And there were two things that happened. One is that you saw the share prices start to fall. And the other thing was that you started to see volatility as measured by the VIX index start to rise. And anyone who plays in financial markets keeps a close eye on the VIX index as an indicator of current or expected volatility in the market. And as you see volatility start to rise, you tend to get more bearish. What goes into that is a whole range of different indicators. Like what goes into a market assessment of financial risk is everything from inflation, employment, interest rates, etc. And so financial markets are reasonably well calibrated to understand and act on risk, but still get it wrong, famously wrong in many instances. On the other hand, what we're seeing now in the climate space is an undeniable increase in volatility. I would actually even say whether or not you believe human beings are responsible for climate change, and I realize that sounds like a stupid question to even be asking for many of our listeners, and certainly in the UK and Europe, but let's acknowledge that there is a pool of people that believes human beings are not responsible for climate change. But it's undeniable that you're seeing more volatility in the climate. And there is an impact that has on global supply chains, and there's an impact that has on actors in supply chains. And so I would actually say we have a very, very poor understanding of that volatility and the impact it has because we've never really experienced it.
What are the emerging risks then? What is feeding into that volatility?
There are, I think, a few big feeders. One is, let's say, macro, and the other is micro. And what I mean by macro is agroclimatic zones are changing. Certain crops were best grown in certain agroclimatic zones. And a sign of a crop being grown really well is that you can grow it at high yield for a long period of time. A great example, let's say, roses in Ethiopia. Ethiopia is one of the best countries in the world to grow roses. You can grow roses for most of the year. I don't know if it's 7 or 8 or 9 months, but most of the year. And you can grow them at a high yield, which means you get the lowest possible marginal cost because your infrastructure for growing and transporting it is spread over a really long period of time and a really high yield over that period of time. That is like a perfect match of agroclimatic zone to crop type. And this big macro shift is that those agroclimatic zones are changing. You are seeing it already in the wine market in the UK versus France, for example, where it's getting harder to achieve similar yields for similar periods of time in France and easier in the UK. And you're going to see that play out across multiple crop types around the world. I would argue potentially faster than we expect because climate, if you just look at global warming, it's happening faster than we expect. And so that's the macro shift. The micro shift is actually within at the level of individual operators, practices are having to change week by week. And the most prominent example of that is in certain parts of the world at certain times of the year, it is just too hot to go out and pick the crop. And it is just too hot to go out and do anything, frankly, on the farm. Where I'm from, Pakistan, there are parts of the agricultural heartland that are hitting 50 degrees Celsius at certain times of the year and crossing 50 degrees Celsius at certain times of the year, which is just like physically too hot to actually go out there without the body actually, without lethal exposure, without actual death. And I think that is going to profoundly change the practices of individual operators, let alone all the other kind of micro risks, which is what is heat wave and flooding and all this stuff do to your farm.
Are there any big commodity trends that you're seeing as a result, maybe on a macro level and a micro level? So are there any specific crop types that are particularly vulnerable to these risks?
I would argue that the crop types that are least vulnerable are actually crop market combinations or variety market combinations. And so if I take, let's say, salad tomatoes as an example, salad tomatoes are effectively within the tomato space, they're premium versus tomatoes that you would use for ketchup because they're going to be seen. They need a certain optical characteristics. They need to look good, frankly. And maybe the supply chain is also shorter. So the margin tends to be higher, which means that you can afford to produce those in a greenhouse where you are producing them in a controlled environment where you can control heating and cooling. And so the Netherlands, for example, has a dominant share in the salad tomato market, and most of that production happens in greenhouses in the Netherlands run on natural gas. And so that is more or less insulated versus climate change as compared to as compared to tomatoes for ketchup, for example, most of which will be grown in places like China, Pakistan, maybe Spain in parts, where in peak production season, the marginal price of the tomato will just plummet. Like if you think of those festivals in Spain where everyone is kind of throwing throwing the tomatoes around, like that comes from just an abundance that you have in season, and you have the same in Pakistan, again where I'm from, and so that side will suffer much more from this volatility versus the premium end or the end with the higher margin where you can justify controlled agriculture.
What about crop types that are very specific to certain regions, which perhaps you can't shift your supply chain, or it's
Yeah, this gets really interesting, and so I would maybe split. I'd make a distinction as you think about supply chain disruption, Izzy, which is what we're really looking at here. I would say there's a distinction between where you have agricultural produce with a short supply chain, where that produce is moving maybe directly into a branded processing. And let's take the tomatoes for ketchup as an example. Very often, those tomatoes will kind of move, maybe there'll be one or two tiers from the brand, one or two tiers of supplier away from the brand. Let's take a contrast. And so, sorry, in that case, I actually think that you're going to get some relatively immediate disruption that the brand is going to have to start thinking about and have to start thinking about where do they source from differently, or how do they start building up a supply chain in other regions, because they're going to start to get this disruption. If you look at the coffee market and the cocoa market, the buyers there are already thinking about this, because cocoa and coffee and vanilla and a bunch of these specialties are super centralized in really 4 or 5 countries, which dominate they have the lion's share of this market. Cocoa and coffee, for example, you're looking at like Ghana, Cote d'Ivoire, a few other countries being the lion's share. And if the agroclimatic zone shifts from those regions, those countries to others, you suddenly have to spin up a whole different supply chain. I think there's another world where you say, well, let's look at cotton, where you have maybe multiple tiers of supplier in between the grower and the brand. And therefore, you've had a whole complex manufacturing ecosystem develop around the location of production. And so let's take, for example, again, Pakistan is a good example with cotton. Not to keep coming back to Pakistan, but I feel like I should do my duty and reference it in this podcast. But if you look at cotton, Pakistan has been a top 5 grower of cotton. And based on that, you have a whole ecosystem of manufacture around that. So the mills and so on, but many tiers of suppliers have all kind of grown up in Pakistan and established in Pakistan. As the zone starts shifting, as yields start becoming harder and more volatile, along with other geopolitical risks and exposures, those manufacturers the larger ones have vertically integrated and become kind of larger players owning more of the supply chain stack, and also multi-geographied, whatever the right term is. They've started sourcing from multiple locations to hedge their exposure to one country. And actually, if you look at most of the big textile manufacturing partners, so if you take like a Uniqlo or an H&M or an Inditex, Zara, for instance, you'll see that there are probably like somewhere between 50 and 100 major apparel manufacturing partners that they work with. And often those 50 to 100, a majority of them might be owned by a few dozen conglomerates, basically. And those conglomerates are just operating across Vietnam, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Pakistan, China, India, all together. And they're flexibly sourcing the actual agricultural input from any location that makes sense, and they're manufacturing in whatever location makes sense for different brand partners.
I think when you were speaking about that, another example which popped to mind was olives and olive oil, because I think recently there's been a huge global shortfall of olive oil. Like, I remember seeing headlines that olive oil is the most shoplifted product in Spain at the moment. I think that was back in April or something, because it was just at such a high cost point. And I think that's been a result of like extreme drought conditions for the last 3 years. And Spain in particular grows about 60% of all the olive oil. But as I said, like wildfires and really hot temperatures have basically completely floored the production. And I was speaking to someone from Bella Zoo, Ruby, and she was saying, and I was like, oh, like, what's up? Like, olive oil production must be really tough at the moment. Has that impacts your prices? And she was like, well, actually, we have really good relationships with olive growers, and because their Bella Zoo, their olive oils have come out at maybe a higher premium cost point, they've actually been able to invest much more into those farmers to make sure it's like good agricultural practices, better soil, so they're more resilient to this change. They've also said that they actually have now moved some of their olive groves to Essex, because the groves actually benefit really well from the kind of the coastal conditions and also the warmer weathers, like what you were saying around production moving, like wine production moving from France to the UK. And it slightly just got me thinking that whether, and correct me if I'm wrong, but is risk, is is the like supply chain risk much more felt by like mass market brands versus these like luxury higher premium brands? Is that punt kind of right to you?
Yeah, I would say let's look at risk as a ledger. You have pluses and minuses. You have elements adding risk and elements removing risk. And so let's acknowledge that climate change is one big risk addition, and it's out of our control. It has come into play and it's added a huge element of risk, which is volatility. You have certain other elements of risk that are intrinsic to the nature of the product or the supply chain. So in olives, for example, you have a lot of capex. Like the tree that you have grown is a capex investment someone has made. It has taken some time, years really, to reach maximum productivity. And so that is a sunk cost. That's like a capex investment I've made, which is different to planting wheat or potatoes. If I have a bad year with potatoes, I can exit potatoes and go and plant something else. I don't have a sunk cost that I've lost. I just have that 1 year's crop, which is different to anything where you're planting a tree or a bush. And so that capex element is another risk component. Margin also has an impact on risk. And so if I have a thin margin, I am more at risk of going bust because I have very little cushion or very little insulation. If I have a larger margin, I have less risk exposure in some ways because I can cushion myself against volatility. You'll have other elements as well. Like if I'm a supplier, how long duration is the contract of what I'm selling into? If I'm supplying into Belazoo, do I have a 10-year contract or do I have a 6-month or 1-year contract? That also has a calibration on risk. And then concurrently, you can also say, what are the interventions I could put into play to remove risk from the system? And so I think the best way to look at this is there are things adding risk and there are things you can do to remove risk quantitatively. Making contract duration longer will remove risk for my supplier if that's what I want to do. Making margin larger will remove risk from my supplier if that's what I want to do. Having insurance in play for my suppliers and pushing my suppliers to get insured and helping my suppliers get insurance will act as a cushion where there isn't a margin to provide that cushion for the supplier. It's almost like, if you're a high income person, you don't need insurance as much as a lower income person because you have cushion, you can have savings that will cushion you in bad times. Whereas actually the people who are most vulnerable to an absence of good insurance are those on lower incomes. And so I think a lot of the same principles, what adds risk and like the corollary is what can I use to subtract risk, is a good mindset to take here.
Okay, so just summarizing a little bit what you just said there. So some of the best measures to build resilience into your supply chain as a business or as a sustainability professional is supply contracts, building in a bigger margin, and maybe insurance programs. Would you add any more to that?
I would say there's a bunch, and I think some of these will be more or less palatable. So I think there is a level of focus right now on how do I actually remove climate change associated risk more directly. And so if you look at like regenerative agriculture and all the stuff that many sustainability leaders are thinking about in terms of making farms more resilient in themselves, I would say that's kind of trying to like help adapt the environment towards climate change risk, and that's removing an element of risk in itself. And then the other bits that you've listed, I would say, are other levers. Now, most procurement teams will be allergic to the idea of expanding the margin for their suppliers because that's just like diametrically opposed to their incentive structure. And so I would say that you need to make sure that there's a playbook. I'm thinking from the perspective of a sustainability leader, let's say in a brand. If you want your procurement team to work with you on taking risk out of this, you need to do two things. One is explain to them that long-term their KPIs are going to suffer if together you don't solve this problem. And that's because changing suppliers can often be disruptive and have a cost. And having a supplier suffer a shortfall in yield versus expectation and not be able to provide output when expected will have an impact on the brand in terms of its economics. And also that you can actually provide the procurement team with a range of levers to think about, and they will work with you on this, to help remove risk in a way that is maybe more palatable for the financial incentives of your business. And those could be longer duration contracts, for example.
Okay, I love that playbook. I'm definitely going to steal that and throw it into a newsletter somewhere. But I think another bit that you mentioned was like regenerative agriculture, maybe like innovative practices. And I think, well, you had a previous discussion with Audrey Leduc from McCain's, and I think they do an awesome piece where they have recently launched maybe their third Farmers for the Future. So they've got one in Canada and one in Africa. I can't remember where the last one is, but they are set up to test new varieties of potato crop, because obviously potatoes, they are Mr. and Mrs. Potato, like they want to own the potato. So they're working in these different locations, so they're different kind of big climatic areas, to reimagine growing practices and to be able to account for the climate and like stressed growing areas. And their goal is to have largely replaced their standard varieties of potatoes by 2030, whilst also gaining full customer approvals for those options. And potatoes, for reference, actually take quite a bit longer. Their like seed pipeline takes longer to develop than other crop types, just because it's a slow growing crop. But they've been evaluating traits like disease resistance, nitrogen use efficiency, yield, quality, different kind of climatic growing conditions. And this slightly just got me thinking about this customer approval piece and how that fits into risk. So like, how can you communicate as a brand that, okay, my product might be changing, my quality might be changing, my look might be changing because I'm sourcing my potatoes from here or there? Is there any advice that you would have to make that point clear and get the consumer or your customer, if you're for B2B, behind you?
Yeah, this is an interesting one. And I think this goes well beyond what we're thinking about with risk, which is, if the nature of my product is going to be different, it is going to look different, feel different, taste different, as a result of what I am doing from a sustainability lens, whether that's mitigating risk or whether it's reducing, for example, the emissions intensity of my product, how do I bring my customer along with me? And so you've got a good example there with potatoes, Izzy. Another one that I think about is like with bottled beverages, for example. If you increase the share of recycled content or cullet in the bottle, it'll turn greener. And then there's like other methods, like you reduce the size of the stem because the stem tends to be very emissions inefficient. And that actually has an impact on how the consumer might perceive the product in the case of the greenish tint, and also how they might use the product in the case of using the stem to hold a beer bottle, for example. And I think that the best way to deal with this is actually to make it feel premium. Like if you think of, let's say, take a bottle of whiskey, right? Like if most bottles of whiskey are flint colored, and you say we have a super dark green whiskey bottle, and it is as dark as a wine bottle, but it's whiskey, and it's actually premium, by the way. And here are all its credentials to be premium. Here is its license to be premium, and we're going to charge extra for it. I think that's the best way to start to get consumers to be happy with those changes. If you think about, let's say, bottled water, when you kind of, I forget what the brand is, it's like a tube rather than a standard kind of,
Voss?
I
Is
think
it
it's Voss,
Voss?
right? I think it's
Yeah.
Voss. Yeah, Voss has a premium feel to it. And I think that that's the look and feel that you want to get with your sustainability interventions, where it feels premium and it feels expensive rather than cheaper and worse off.
I want to get on to environmental data and what these supply chain disruptions can mean for your data, and what it means for collection and what it means for management. Do you have any or have you seen any trends, firstly, of like how companies are like mitigating for risk and how they're managing data differently to account for it?
Yes, I would say I think that. So let's maybe start with the concept of double materiality, which, if you look at like European regulation and CSRD framing, we're thinking about the impact that you have on the world and the impact that the world has on you. So the impact you have on the world is like your emissions footprint. The impact the world has on you is the impact or risk of climate change disruption on your supply chain, for instance. And I think that right now, we are largely treating those two things in silos, and they come together a bit for reporting, but we're largely dealing with those two things separately. There are certain parts of the market that are getting to be very deep on one or the other. And so insurance companies and banks are, I would hope, much more forward leaning on the risk assessment side. infrastructure companies tend to be much more forward leaning on the risk assessment side because they have so much at stake from getting this right or wrong. And let's say food and bev, apparel, personal care companies buying from agricultural value chains, which are also inherently like emissions intensive in some shape or form and have some risk exposure, are trying to figure out both. And then there's a category of companies that are probably not really thinking about risk at all and just focused on the emissions of the business. And I would say probably a lot of like tech companies which have a big emissions footprint from the cloud are thinking about their emissions footprint, but really the risk side is hard for them to get their head around and not so important compared to others. Um, I think that we're going to see a trend where the companies that have exposure or elements of both start treating the problem as a joint problem and thinking about data in a joined up way, which means that if you're having to use data for activities, locations, weights in your emissions calculation, you may as well also get value out of that data from your risk assessment. Because if you know that you're buying, let's say, cotton from Pakistan and certain geographies, and you have a really good sense of what activities go into that, and you have a really good sort of capability around what types of farms is that cotton coming from, you can actually get a lot of value from that sort of data and a really good risk assessment. And you can start to put into play a lot of risk mitigation levers that can be very specific as well. That's a trend I don't yet see playing out, but I think it will happen in the next few years.
Really interesting. And in terms of being able to make sure that your data can be transferable into that like risk box, are there any tips or tricks that you would say that maybe sustainability professionals at the early stage now who haven't started thinking of it like that can actually get ahead of the curve?
Yeah, I think it goes back, Izzy, to something that we talk about often, which is before you dive into data gathering and data manipulation, let's start with what is the problem that you want to solve and why. So if you say, look, I want to really get a good handle on my emissions, and there are some materials that are most important for me in my emissions calculation because they are intrinsically associated with my brand, my production, etc. I am a chocolate business and this is cocoa for me. Or I am a sort of dairy business and this is like I'm a dairy intensive business and this is the actual dairy production for me. Then great. That'll help you get a good handle on what data you need to go deep on for emissions calculations purposes and what data maybe is less important. There is likely also to be a big risk aspect to that. And so I think it's helpful for you to also say, well, if I was also solving for a great risk assessment and trying to manage interventions that minimize disruption, is it the same types of data that I need, or are there a few additional elements that would help me get the most value from my data gathering process? And I think you'll find that the answer is yes. And actually, it's not a lot of additional data. And whatever additional data it is might also make the emissions calculation more granular, more specific, more accurate.
Okay. And from another lens on the data point is when one of the kind of mitigation measures to your supply chain risk is also like diversifying your supply chain. How should we look at that in a sense that you're going out to maybe new suppliers, you're starting afresh? Are there any bits of advice that you would actually say is like, okay, this is a great opportunity for supply chain engagement or setting up this supplier to be able to be a like reliable, a sustainable supplier? What's your take on that?
Yes, it's a good question, Izzy. I would actually think in a more joined up way about what is the purpose here. The purpose is taking risk out of the system. And there can be multiple ways to take risk out of the system, and there might be a trade-off. Like the beautiful thing with risk is risk should be fungible to some extent. Like if you can quantify this properly, then I can take risk out using lever A or lever B, and there should be an ability for me to, in a straightforward way, compare lever A and lever B because the target, the thing I'm optimizing is the same, which is risk. And let me pose two interventions that are opposed to each other. One is, do I do more business with one supplier and lean more heavily into de-risking that supplier? Or do I not do anything with that supplier to de-risk them, but do I actually hedge my bets by working with 10 suppliers? And I don't think there is a simple answer to that. I think it will vary company to company. But there is a good logic to say, look, I'm buying cocoa. Let me work with three intermediaries and let me do the best thing I can to remove risk from those three intermediaries and build long-term partnerships such that those three intermediaries are always in business and will always do well and will always be resilient, and it's a true partnership, versus do I just spread my bets across as many as possible, which could actually increase my risk. Because maybe actually I'm doing business with 100 intermediaries, they're all dependent on Ghanaian cocoa, and as agroclimatic zones shift, the market moves to other locations and I'm completely exposed. So I would actually say that you need to get a much deeper understanding before you go for lever A or B, and there might just be a simple trade-off between them.
Talking about cocoa there just reminded me of we were both at an event together. I think it was maybe March of this year, and we both tried no cocoa chocolate. And that was as a result of, I think it was Phaser who supplied the goods there. And what she was saying was that actually cocoa is quite a high risk commodity type, and especially with the changing weather patterns, where, as you said, we source cocoa from a couple of countries. The majority comes from a couple of countries as it is now, and maybe that pool of suppliers is getting smaller and smaller and smaller. So maybe one of the other measures is not just supply chain diversification, but actually like product type diversification, and trying to, what we said earlier about bringing the consumer on board. Because no cocoa chocolate is quite a big, bold move to go out with. But I think that's also maybe an interesting lens to apply here.
It is. And Izzy, I think the interesting thing is that, again, double materiality works together here. Because there are two interventions that can both reduce your emissions and also reduce your risk exposure together. One is transition to a lower emissions intensity product, and that's going to lower your emissions profile, but also very likely reduce your risk exposure depending on what you're transitioning to, let's say. The second is actually use less of it or reduce the waste associated with it, for example, which will also reduce your emissions and also reduce risk exposure. And that's because both of these interventions are at the end of the stack, which means that they apply across the whole stack of your sourcing, production, etc. environment, because they happen right at the end. And they're therefore more impactful than anything you could do at any one point in that chain.
That's a really cool way of looking at it. I also want to ask you about any cool pieces of tech innovations that you've seen that actually are helping manage these climate-related supply chain risks.
Yeah, so I think that the transition we're seeing, certainly with the companies we work with, is towards a unified sustainability operating system. And so if you think about, let's say, 2 years ago, there was a generation of carbon accounting companies, and there was, let's say, a generation of climate risk management companies. And so, maybe Servest and Jupiter Intelligence and a bunch of others were on the climate risk side, and Altruistic and others were on the, let's say, accounting side. And I think what you're seeing is that potentially you actually in some cases have a merging where we now, for instance, see ourselves as a sustainability operating system. And the reason that we see ourselves as a sustainability OS is because we're gathering data at a granular level, we're assigning classifications and tags at a granular level, and we are using that data to calculate emissions and footprints, but we are also allowing users to use that data in its own native right to manipulate it, achieve insights, design programs. And actually, those programs could increasingly be risk mitigation oriented, just as much as they could be emissions impact reduction oriented. And I think that is the transition towards being actually a sustainability operating system where the data can be used for multiple different use cases.
And are there any key characteristics to look out for those sustainable operating systems that would be good bets?
I think the real question to ask is, what is this system or solution solving for? Are they solving for environmental accounting or carbon accounting? Is that the North Star for them? Is the North Star to be the world's best carbon accounting platform? Because if it is, then the marginal gain will always be in doing carbon accounting a little better and doing it for more people. And actually, the companies that have that as their North Star will probably want to do that for the widest set of businesses possible. They are less likely to be industry specific, for instance. Whereas if you're trying to be a sustainability operating system, it is almost impossible that within the next 6, 7, 8, 9 years, you will be that system for companies across industries because there is just too much subject matter variability. And if you look at, like, let's say doing even product carbon footprints, and we'll talk about this in our webinar, if you look at doing product carbon footprints for food, they are very different to how you would do it for apparel, for instance, or for other sectors, or let alone for metals and mining and jewelry and those things. And so if you want to be a sustainability operating system, you're probably committing to a particular industry, and you in the way that we are committing to food and beverage, for example, and you are looking to kind of then be a flexible data environment to be able to solve for a wide range of use cases. So you're going much deeper at the cost of going broad.
That makes total sense. I think before we wrap up, Steph, I got one last question, which is, and you briefly spoke about it, talking about how you communicate to procurement around these like risk mitigation levers. But I'd love to understand how you would see the best way of like packaging up risk and supply chain and disruption and all of that into a business case to maybe unlock more funds or unlock more resources to be able to mitigate against it.
So Izzy, as always, I would package it in dollars. I would literally wrap it up in a big bundle of dollars with a big dollar number around it. And what I mean by that is any sustainability team that wants to get things done should position their business cases internally with a dollar impact. And so if we're looking at, let's say, emissions reductions, I think we should start to think about what does this get us in terms of efficiency cost savings? What does this get us in terms of market share? What does this get us in terms of pricing potential? What does this get us in terms of enduring brand advantage? That one is always harder to quantify, but you should try. And when we're approaching risk mitigation, what is the dollar cost of disruption? If I have a supply chain disrupted for a month or 2 months, what does that cost my business? The good thing for sustainability teams is there's great data around this because we had it in COVID. COVID is a great example where supply chains globally were disrupted. And so there is a muscle memory in procurement teams of having to solve for that. And different teams had to solve for it in different ways, but everyone remembers it as a traumatic experience. So there may well be a once in a career lifetime opportunity for sustainability teams to tap into that trauma and say, look, let's make this never happen again. And by the way, the next COVID is climate change.
The next COVID is climate change, coining. There's like this instinctive nature in me that I always feel that I need to package up sustainability or climate change in quite like a positive way in order to get more people on board. What you're saying there perhaps suggests that actually you need to lean more into the trauma. Is that right? Or like, how would you play the kind of positive, negative reinforcements?
Climate change is a dark and depressing topic. It is much more Dostoevsky than Tolstoy. I think it is misleading to position it as a positive, frankly. Like there may well be a positive in, let's say, capturing pricing premium and market share. But even if you look at the sustainability leaders who do that, who build a great sustainability brand, they are positioning this as a battle against the forces of darkness. If you look at a Tony's Chocolonely, they're talking about slave labor in the value chain. It doesn't get darker than that. If you look at Oatly, they're talking about global warming at large scale, and by the way, potentially also a massive dose of cruelty to animals. Like, this is dark stuff, and I think that dollars have a purity to them. I would always talk about both aspects in just the same terms as the business talks about everything else, which is this is business. This is dollars up and dollars down.
You talk about the commercial uplifts, but also about the commercial risks, essentially. But moving away from those dark corners of climate change, Steph, is there anything else you want to talk about? Maybe to leave us on more of a positive, optimistic note before we say goodbye.
we are starting more or less from ground zero on all these topics. And we have, in this podcast, Izzy, we've been excited to talk about emissions calculation and a lot of the stuff associated with that. I think that risk and managing climate change related risk is going to be bigger, frankly. Like, I just think it's going to be a bigger problem to solve. I think it's going to be more complex in many ways to solve it. In a way, I'm coming at that from a dark place, which is I think we're going to shatter through 2 degrees. I don't think we're going to solve for climate change. I think we have the potential to make a dent in the problem, but like it's happening. And I think that the realization that it's happening means you start to also just think about risk. You start to think about adaptation and resilience as well as just mitigation. Mitigation is, am I reducing global warming? Am I reducing the emissions out there? Resilience and adaptation is more like, am I actually able to cope with what's going to happen?
Okay, thank you. You gave me a more positive note. So maybe to quickly summarize, we have gone through the different types of risks that pose to your supply chain stability, but whether it be macro sustainability shifts or micro sustainability shifts, we've also kind of leaned into the mitigation levers available to you. So maybe that's long-term contracts, maybe that is increasing your margins, or maybe that's insurance programs. We then went on to preparing for the data changes that might happen, but also I loved how you said that there was a positive that could come out of that in terms of the transferability from your carbon and environmental data alongside maybe the risk data that you can feed in. And then we lastly talked about the technological innovations that actually could come in handy, and mostly around sustainability operating systems, and maybe looking at ones which could be more industry focused. Those are probably the better ones to go for where you're sitting in the market. Seth, is there anything I've missed or anything you want to highlight again? Please take it away.
No, I think that's good. I think we should probably spend maybe more time sharing content on risk management levers. And so maybe this is a topic for a guide at some point, Izzy, and potentially our listeners can let us know if that's something they would be excited by.
Or maybe even a webinar. Yeah, and our listeners can have this live.
Maybe even a webinar.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Seth, and speak soon. Goodbye.
Thanks, Izzy. Bye.